Hello, ladies, and welcome back to the next and actually, hopefully, the last presentation on Course Companion 5A, which is Perfect Competition in Perfectly Competitive Markets and Monopoly. So we're going to start from page 25 in your booklets for this one. And remember, we looked at perfect competition, and we looked at the different options of supernormal, normal profits, and subnormal profits in terms of how that can be illustrated via the use of diagrams and then explained. And then we looked at the critique of perfect competition, and we've listed some criticisms and also some defensive points for why perfect competition can be useful. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do, we're going to look at 4 questions, which are on page 25 through to 27 of your booklet, and then we'll move on and take a look at monopolistic competition. So let's take a look at the first question then. Okay, so you can see on page 25 in your booklets that you've got a multi-choice question where you've got revenue and costs plotted against output, and basically we've got a perfectly competitive situation there, as you can be told by the price being the perfectly horizontal, perfectly elastic, and basically you're being asked, based on the above diagram of a short-run perfectly competitive firm, it can be deduced that the firm will do one of 5 things: shut down immediately, raise price, expand output, continue to produce at Q1 in the short run, and finally, possibly lower price. So if we take a look at the scenario such as it stands at the moment, we can see that in the position that's been shown in the diagram, average costs are higher than average revenue. So clearly, we are in a scenario where we are not actually making a profit at all. However, we can see, if we look at our average variable costs, that we actually are covering that at one point, and then at 2 different points, and then we actually are at a point where our average variable cost is higher than our average revenue. So on the basis of that, and the basis that you might need to look back at some of the diagrams that we've looked at previously, but fundamentally in this instance we would choose D. We would continue to produce at Q1, which is our profit maximization point, where MC equals MR, because at that point we've got a price which is higher than average variable cost at the point of Q1. Okay. Now, clearly, if that point was at the point where average variable cost was higher than our average revenue, then or our price, the price that we were being charged, then we would be thinking about shutting down. But in this instance, it's actually we would continue at Q1 in the short run. Remember, short run rather than long run. Okay. You have to excuse in the background. We've got. I'll just wait for a minute. It's finally gone past. You can probably see from the background that I'm actually sat in school rather than at home, and hence the Castle Lane stream of police cars and ambulances seem to be in evidence. But anyway, let's crack on. So that's multi-choice question 1. The second question then. Okay, multi-choice question 2. A loss-making motor vehicle manufacturing firm is most likely to continue in production in the short run if. And then again, 5 options. Average revenue exceeds average fixed cost. B, the government subsidies are withdrawn. C, average revenue exceeds marginal revenue. D, staff threaten industrial disruption. Or E, average revenue exceeds average variable cost. So those options, if you're a loss-making company in the short run, you are only likely to do that and to carry on in the short run if basically you have average revenue that exceeds average variable cost. And again, if you look back at your notes and look back at some of the diagrams we've done previously, you will see that that is the case. So that would be the answer for question number 2. So let's take a look at question number 3 then. So in this instance, we've got a competitive firm that's on this now on page 26 in your booklets. A perfectly competitive firm is in short-run equilibrium and making supernormal profits. Okay, so good for them, in a good position. Okay, the firm is producing a level of output at which either marginal revenue is zero. That's response A. B, total cost is minimized. C, marginal profit is zero. D, total revenue is less than total cost. And E, marginal cost is negative. So if we're in a position where we're in short run equilibrium and we're making supernormal profit, that suggests that we are probably in profit maximization mode. So in this instance then, to take a look at question 3, it would basically be at the point at which marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So basically, we're not making any profit at all. So MC equals MR, and so the answer would be marginal profit is zero. Okay, so that all makes, I think, a reasonable amount of sense, doesn't it? Okay, now the next question. There are a number of things that you're going to need to interpret from the graph that you've been given, okay? So you've got on the bottom of page 26, you've got a diagram which has given you marginal cost, and average variable cost, okay? So in this scenario, then you've got a range of questions, and there are 10 questions on that chart. Now, you might think, well, is there enough information on that chart to be able to answer all those questions? Well, clearly there is if you actually read the question and interpret it in the correct fashion. Now, in this instance, we've got our price ranging from 0 to £12, and we've got our quantity ranging from 0 through to 100 units, okay? And you will see the first question there. How much will the firm produce in order to maximise profits at a price of £8 per unit? Okay, so if we take our £8 per unit and draw across to the point at which, if we're profit maximising, MC equals MR, that's basically, oh, hold on, there's some more examples of or more rationale behind the reason for multi-choice question 3 on the slide there. Okay, so again, one of the things that we can do, sorry to jump back again, is to use a process of elimination. So clearly in this instance, it's the answer for question 3 wouldn't be A, because if marginal revenue equals 0, in perfect competition, then average revenue would also equal 0. So price is obviously higher than 0, isn't it? Okay. So not B, because it's not producing on an upward sloping section of the AC curve. Okay. So that would be the reason why total cost is not minimized at this point. And it's not D because total revenue is actually less than total cost, and in that position we would be in a loss or subnormal profit. And finally, last but not least, it wouldn't be E, because if that were the case, then we clearly marginal cost would be less than 0. Oh, sorry, marginal cost would be higher than 0. However, there would be other costs involved too. Okay, so that's just helping you to sort of post-rationalise your answer. Now, clearly, you wouldn't have to explain that as such, but that's a process that you could go through. Okay, let's take a look then at, sorry to jump back to page 26, 27. That's the diagram that you've got in your booklets. Okay, so we've got marginal cost, average variable cost lines drawn in. And the first question we've been asked is, in this situation, is how much will a firm produce in order to maximise profits at a price of £8 per unit? Remember, it's telling us that this diagram, just above the diagram itself, it's telling us the following diagram shows the cost curves of a firm under perfect competition. So we know a perfectly competitive market. Remember the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market, the fact that we are actually price takers. The market is telling us what the price should be, but in this scenario, we're telling the firm has to produce at £8 per unit. So if we draw in £8 per unit, our marginal revenue equaling our average revenue at that point, we should be able to see at that point that if we then take a look at the point at which we have marginal cost equaling marginal revenue, that should then give us an idea of where and how many units we would choose to produce at that particular price. So taking a look at that, we've obviously got our marginal cost line. I'll just show you the cursor. The marginal cost line is going here like so. And effectively our marginal revenue is now at £8 per unit. So where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, the point at which we would profit maximise, this is the point that we would be producing if we were attempting to profit maximise. Okay, so in this instance then, the other thing to bear in mind, and we'll come back and take a look at this as we go later, these other points that are included are relevant to further questions. So let's draw these in, and then actually hopefully it will make a bit more sense now. Okay, so if we take a look at, in this instance, the first question, as we said, the level where marginal cost equals marginal revenue at £8 per unit is basically at this point here. So if we draw down to find out the quantity we would produce, we would be producing 70 if we were profit maximising at that point. Okay, so let's take a look at the next question then. What will be the average cost of production at this output? Okay, so we can see at this level of output that our average cost is basically this line here. Okay, so at the point at which the average cost would be at 70 units, it would be £6 per unit. Okay, so you can see, well, no, sorry, that would be the selling price, or the selling. It's also essentially the cost price per unit. Okay, so the average cost per unit is £6, as we can see there. Okay, so that answers question B. If we then take a look at how much supernormal profit will it make on that basis, well, we can see that at this point here, we've got £6 as our average cost. We've got £8 as our marginal revenue, and average revenue. So for each unit that we produce, we are going to make £2 profit. Okay. Now, clearly, we're producing 70 units. So in this instance, the answer would be £140. Okay, so 8 minus 6 times the amount that we produced gives us 70 units times 2 gives £140 worth of supernormal profit. Okay, let's take a look at question D then. This is on page 27 in your booklets now. How much will the firm produce in order to maximise profits at a price of £5 per unit? So the second line that we've drawn in, that we put in slightly earlier, is marginal revenue for question D. Okay, and average revenue for question D in this instance. Okay, so you can see at this point now we've got a significantly lower selling price. Okay, so in order to, how much would the firm produce in order to maximise profits at £5? Well, in this instance, we could see that if we take our £5 price and then look at where that now, so that's now our new average revenue. If we then take a look at our where our marginal cost curve crosses, then effectively we're now in a position where our profit maximisation point would be significantly less in terms of the number of units. So for question D, it would actually be 50. So we can see 50 units is the point at which our average revenue and our marginal cost curves cross. And obviously, because our average revenue is the same as our marginal revenue in perfect competition, that's the point at which we would be producing if we were attempting to profit maximise. Okay, so at that point there, then, if we take a look at the average cost and the average revenue and also the marginal cost, at that point there, if we're producing 50 units and the price was £5, then actually we would be making no profit at all, would we? Okay, well, normal profits rather than no profit. Okay, so normal profits where essentially our average cost and our average revenue are basically the same. Okay, so we've essentially covered that. but not made any profit. Okay, so let's take a look at question F then. How much would the firm produce in order to maximise profits, or in this case, possibly even to minimise losses, at a price of £4 per unit? So drawing in our £4 per unit price, or marginal revenue, average revenue line. Well, at that point there, if we then take a look at profit maximisation, where MC equals MR at £4, well, in this instance, we would be in a position where our average revenue would be significantly below our marginal cost at that particular point. So in this scenario, we would actually be making sorry, I'm jumping around a bit. I haven't included the next question. So how much for, so this is for question F. How much will the firm produce in order to profit maximise at £4 per unit? We can see in this instance where average cost or average revenue or marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's the point at which we would produce at 40 units, okay? Now, in this situation, we can see that our average cost is higher than our average revenue. So clearly, we are not in the greatest spot as far as that's concerned. So our quantity for question F would be 40. However, G, what would be the profit position now? Well, basically, we can see that in this situation, the amount of sales that we're achieving, let's go back one, is £4 per item. But we can see that basically our average cost, stop that doing that, please. My fault, nobody else's. We can see that our average cost at that point is around about £5.50. Okay, so fundamentally, we've got a scenario where for every one that we sell at £4, our average cost is £5.50. So in that position, clearly we would be in a loss scenario. Okay, so £1.50 times the 40 units, giving a £60 loss. Okay. So then let's look at the last two questions, H and I. Okay, below what price would the firm shut down in the short run? Okay, so if that were the case, remember we said that the price at which we would actually start to think about shutting down would be the point at which we're not even covering our average variable cost. Okay, so in this situation, our minimum average variable cost is at the point where our price is £3.50. So you can see that if we're selling at less than £3.50, that's the point at which our average variable cost is at its lowest. Okay, so we can see in that situation that we would actually be making, we'd need to be selling at £3.50 minimum in order to not have to shut down. Okay, but below what price would the firm shut? So that's in the short run. Okay, so that's where we haven't covered average variable costs. However, if we're talking about the long run, because provided we've got our average variable costs covered, we might choose to carry on, if you remember when we talked previously. And in that scenario, we would be looking for a minimum of £5, where effectively, like we looked at previously, where we're selling at a point where our average cost is equal to our average revenue, okay, and that is at our profit maximisation point, in this case of 50 units. So the minimum that we would want to be selling at would be our minimum average cost, which is at £5, okay. So you can see from a relatively simple diagram with a couple of extra items included, there's an awful lot of information that you can glean from this as an exercise, and it's quite a good exercise to revise the whole process of profit maximisation, average cost, average revenue, and the point at which we are attempting to perform at profit maximisation. Okay, so hopefully that makes a bit of sense. One of the things we're going to do now and move on to, looking at the amount of time that we've gone through is about 25 minutes or so. I think what we'll do is we'll go through the first couple of bits of monopolistic competition, which is similar sort of stuff that we've done previously, but it starts to look at it in a slightly different market context. So we're not talking perfectly competitive, we're talking monopolistic competition. Okay, so thanks for listening. I think trying to make my mind up really. Let's introduce monopolistic competition at this point, because I think it's definitely worth doing so. Okay, so perfect competition pretty much done, based on the last 2 or 3 narrated PowerPoints. So let's close that one now and open a new one. So that one was perfectly perfect and imperfect competition. Now we're going to take a look at monopolistic competition. So we'll just open this one. Okay, so monopolistic competition, the second of the market structures that we talked about previously. We touched on it very briefly. And remember, in terms of market structures, we have perfectly competitive at one end of the scale, monopolistic competition as the next point, oligopoly at the point after that, and then monopoly after that. Those are the 4 key types of market structure that you'll need to understand. So this is the spec. The exam spec for monopolistic competition is 4.1.5.4. And we'll just look at what you need to understand, okay? Now, it's not dissimilar to the sorts of things that you need to understand as far as perfectly competitive markets are concerned, but certainly we need to be able to explain, draw, and appreciate the diagrammatic analysis of monopolistically competitive markets in both the short and the long run. So basically, pretty much like we did with perfect competition, perfectly competitive markets, but now we've got monopolistically competitive scenarios, and we'll explain what the difference is between perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive markets. Okay. We'll obviously need to understand the main characteristics of monopolistically competitive markets, and that's something we'll look at in a minute. And also the fact that in some instances, and one of the big differences between perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive markets is that you will get some non-price competition. Okay, now that's because in some instances, if we've got products that are slightly different from our competitors, that might mean that we can actually use not just price to differentiate ourselves. And in some cases, if we're able to differentiate ourselves sufficiently, we might also be able to influence our price and the price that we can sell our goods and services to our customers for. So let's take a look at the definition of a monopolistic competition then. And here we go. So it's basically a market structure where, and there are some similarities to perfectly competitive markets, but in this instance, we've got a market structure where there's a large number of small firms, but they produce differentiated products. Okay, so they're non-homogeneous, they are heterogeneous actually, difficult one to say. That means that there is a limited amount of differentiation that these companies are able to offer the market. Okay. In addition to that, there are also very low barriers to entry and to exit of the market. So again, some similarities to perfectly competitive markets. The main difference being that in this instance, we've got businesses that are offering differentiated products. They're not all the same. So the characteristics of monopolistic competition then, okay, I'm just going to move myself over here so that we don't get too confused. Okay, so first things first then, a large number of buyers and sellers in the market, not dissimilar as we said before, but each of those is relatively small and it acts independently, okay? There is an assumption that firms are going to be short-run profit maximizers, and so they are always going to be attempting to produce where the point at which marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So again, similar principles to perfectly competitive markets. There is perfect knowledge, okay? So buyers and sellers know exactly what's going on in the market as a result. There are low barriers to entry and exit, like I explained before, and that's something that we'll look at in a bit more detail after we've finished monopolistic competition. Some of you will be familiar with barriers to entry, but we will go through that in a bit more detail towards the probably not this presentation, the next presentation. Okay, we've got differentiated or non-homogeneous products. Okay, so that does mean that we are offering a slightly different level of product or service to the rest of the market. And we also assume that there are no transport costs included in this form of analysis. Okay, so let's think about this then, the distinction between perfectly competitive and monopolistically competitive markets, then looking at page 28 in your booklets. So in essence, there aren't that many. I suppose one of the main differences is the nature of the product. Okay, so if we're trying to compare perfectly competitive to monopolistically competitive markets, the nature of the product is homogeneous or identical in perfect competition. Okay, they are actually in monopolistic competitive markets slightly differentiated. Okay, not by much, but basically there are examples where, so if we take the restaurant market for instance, all are offering types of food, but those types of food are slightly different from one another, aren't they? And as a result, that does mean that you can to some degree influence the price that you're charging because you're offering something different from the rest of the market. Let's look at some examples then. Okay, so local hairdressers would be an example. If you think about the number of plethora of local hairdressers, some of them that I'm sure you use, that are actually each offering pretty much the same product, i.e. they're offering a haircut, but clearly the ambiance, the place that they're set up, how their salons look, are all slightly different, and prices will also vary. Another example could be local taxi firms. Again, there's a very good reason why we're including local. So local hairdressers and local taxi firms. The reason why we're doing that is when we start to look at oligopoly, and I think actually one of the examples that we did briefly in the booklet where we were looking at trying to decide on whether KFC, what market structure KFC operated in. Well, on one level, they are very much in an oligopolistic market where there's a few large firms on a national scale, but on a regional scale, they will also be competing with the likes of Chicken Tonight, or that's a brand of chicken sauce rather, but you know what I'm saying, California chicken and the various different fried chicken type places that are all dotted all around Bournemouth. So a couple of examples of those that are in monopolistically competitive markets: local taxi firms, local hairdressers, local takeaway restaurants. Okay, not the likes of McDonald's or KFC like I just mentioned. And again, the reason that we've got that star there is to explain in a little bit more detail why that, and for me to remind me to explain in a little bit more detail why that is the case. And it's basically another market structure that we'll look at after we've finished monopolistic competition, which is oligopoly. Okay, so as I've mentioned there, national chains tend to be oligopolistic, but let's not worry about this for the moment. We'll move on and look at that in the next couple of presentations. Okay. So hopefully that makes a reasonable amount of sense. Let's take a look at what the implications are for monopolistic competition then. So, like I mentioned before, if we've got a differentiated product, that means we've got some form of market power. Okay, that does mean that firms can, to some degree, build up some brand loyalty. They might use advertising or branding to support that. But fundamentally, that does mean that we have, maybe limited, but we do have an element of market power that we didn't have or wouldn't have had in a perfectly competitive market. That means that if we've got some point of differentiation and we've got some market power that we can apply, that might mean that we can raise prices without losing all of our customers. to firms which have kept stable prices. Okay. Now, obviously, the reason, well, you can argue the reason, you can have a discussion about the reason, but fundamentally, there are reasons for that, aren't there? If we've actually raised our prices and we're offering something different from other firms, then some people, if they're loyal to us as customers, will choose to still carry on paying that higher price. Okay. So in this instance, and this is one of the big differences between monopolistically and perfectly competitive markets, because we're not price takers, because we're not being told what the price has to be, and that we can sell all of our output at that particular price. In this instance, our demand curve is actually downward sloping. Okay, so our demand curve, which equals our average revenue, is downward sloping. So obviously, as price changes, then the quantity may change in terms of the number of people that will wish to buy our product or service. Okay. So the other thing to bear in mind then is that whilst there is the market power, as a general rule, and remember these theories are chock full of assumptions, okay? But in this scenario, we are assuming that in monopolistically competitive markets, the market power that each firm has is going to be relatively weak because there's a large number of firms producing relatively close substitutes, okay? So if you think about the restaurant market, there's loads and loads of different options that are essentially close substitutes, okay? So what the argument is that the price elasticity of demand in this instance is likely to be relatively elastic, okay? So if there's a significant change in price, there's probably going to be a significant change in demand, okay? But that's clearly going to depend on the brand loyalty that a particular firm or business has managed to engender. And if they're doing something that you really enjoy and really like, then it might mean that you choose to carry on supporting them, even if they've changed their price significantly, okay? But that's the sort of view, and those are some of the implications for monopolistic competition, okay? So I think I might stop there because that sort of introduced it. What we'll do next time round is we'll start to look at how we can demonstrate this both in the short run and the long run in a diagrammatic form, okay? So not dissimilar to the process we've just gone through with our friend perfectly competitive markets, okay? But we'll look at that in terms of how monopolistic markets work, okay? So thank you for your attention once more. I'm going to stop there and I'll post this onto Teams, and via the YouTube channel you can go and take a look at the info that we've gone through, and hope it makes sense.